I inherited 2,500 acres of woodland and farmland from my grandfather, land our family had held for over a century, a place where the hills rolled like sleeping giants and two lakes held the sky like cupped hands, and a ragged line of oaks stitched the southern border with roots older than anyone's memory. My grandfather used to tap the deed with one thick finger and say, "Aaliyah, land is power. Don't you let anybody talk you out of what your people bled to keep." He'd smile then, soft and proud, and I thought those words were just ceremony. Until the day I drove home after years working overseas and found a gated community standing right where our pasture used to breathe. Mansions squared off in cul-de-sacs, a clubhouse glittering behind tinted glass, tennis courts, a golf course curling like an emerald leash around my lakes. The air smelled like new asphalt and fertilizer instead of pine and wet soil, and stamped. On glossy signs at every turn was the name, Silver Pines Community Association. The HOA had arrived like a crown on someone else's head. I pulled over by the old south fence line, where our cattle once nosed through dew, and stared at a fountain shooting water into the sunlight like a champagne toast to theft. The first thing I did was drive to the county records office to learn which devil sold my family's bones without asking me. The receptionist looked up as I walked in, and her smile went tight the way some smiles do when your skin answers a question she didn't say aloud. She pointed me to a clerk who shuffled papers, frowned at the screen, then fetched a file thick enough to use as a doorstop. According to public record, my land had been sold 10 years prior to a developer named Fairway Holdings, LLC. Except I had never sold a blade of grass. I turned each page and felt heat rise behind my ears. The deed carried my father's name with a signature that was almost his but not his, the way a forgery tries too hard. A notary stamp that didn't match state registries. A bill of sale that looked photocopied to death and then resurrected with a rubber stamp. "It all appears legitimate," the clerk said in that tone that sounds like you're the problem for asking. I took pictures of everything and swallowed the kind of anger that can ruin your breath if you let it live too long. Then I hired the sharpest real estate attorney in 3 counties, a woman named Renee Morgan, who wore patience like body armor and did not mistake kindness for surrender. Renee brought in a forensic document examiner, a retired notary with the eyes of a hawk, and a title historian who could read the history of a field like a family Bible. It was fraud, clean, and simple. Someone had lifted my late father's signature from probate paperwork, notarized it with a counterfeit stamp, and slid it into the system. The clerk's office had rubber-stamped it because the paperwork appeared in order, which is how negligence puts on a tie and calls itself professional. Fairway carved my 1,500 acres into parcels and sold the lots to buyers who built their dream homes, who then formed Silver Pines HOA and codified the dream with rules thicker than scripture. It took months to untangle, but every single title transfer traced back to that rotten deed was invalid. Every manicured yard, every stone mailbox, every stretch of road sat on property that still bore my family's name. If rage is gasoline, strategy is the match. I chose strategy. The first time I drove through Silver Pines, the gatehouse guard gave me that crisp smile that bends into suspicion when you don't match the brochure. I parked by the fountain to take evidence photos, and I swear I could feel the neighborhood's gaze like a thermostat flicking 1 degree colder. Within minutes, a trio in pastel polos marched my way, clipboards tucked like batons. Leading them was a woman with blow-dried armor hair and a coral blazer that screamed, "Authority purchased retail." "Excuse me," she called, voice bright as a bell you can't turn off. "This is private property, no photography." "Actually," I said, steady as a level, "this is my property, every inch of it." She laughed like I'd told a joke she'd heard before and still didn't find funny. "Right. Well, if you don't leave, we'll have to involve the sheriff. We have standards here." "Please do," I said. When the deputy arrived, he checked my ID, pulled up the parcel numbers I rattled off, and his eyebrows climbed like hikers hitting steep trail. He glanced between us, then said carefully, "Folks, ownership looks complicated." The woman's smile cracked. Your type of complicated wasn't in their plan. A man in boat shoes said, "We paid good money for our homes, as if money buys absolution." "Maybe you should have checked who you were buying from," I said. And a few faces stiffened the way people do when the word careful really means quiet. The next afternoon, the HOA president emailed me a cease and desist letter accusing me of trespass and harassment of residents. His name was Douglas, ex-banker, handshake like a closing cost, voice like a policy note. And he CC'd half the board so the performance had an audience. That's when I filed a quiet title action, the legal scalpel that cuts rot out of land records. The HOA countersued and painted me as a late-arriving opportunist who saw headlines and dollar signs. The local news bit, "Woman claims entire subdivision built on her land." Comments followed like pigeons. Some defended me, some asked why I hadn't noticed earlier, some said people from outside were always looking for a payday. Funny, given I'd grown up 20 minutes away, and my family's name had shaded county maps since ink learned the paper. The HOA leaned on phrases that don't name a target but point at one anyway. Community character, protecting values, preserving standards, can't let just anyone disrupt our stability. Renee prepared like a surgeon. We lined up experts. The forensic examiner testified the signature was a copy-and-paste job with tremors in all the wrong places. The notary's stamp was counterfeit. The clerk's office admitted the right mistakes while denying the wrong ones. The developer's shell company refused to answer basic questions, like a child caught with crumbs on a face and no cookie jar in sight. The judge, who treated words like expensive tools, finally read the verdict. The court finds the original sale fraudulent. Title to the entire 1,500-acre parcel reverts to Ms. Aaliyah Jameson. A rumble rolled through the courtroom. Shock, sobbing, anger, whispers about fairness that always show up after someone else's fairness is restored. On the courthouse steps, Karen, because what else could I call her, stepped into my space and hissed, "You're ruining our lives." I held her gaze. The good kind of calm feels like level ground. You built over my family's legacy and called it an improvement. I'm just removing the brochure. But I didn't kick anyone out that day. I sent a letter to each address, notarized and neutral. Option A. Buy the land beneath your home at fair market value, approximately $400,000 per lot, and receive a proper recorded deed. Option B. Vacate within 90 days, with a moving stipend for any family that chose to leave within 30. I thought it was generous. Generosity is invisible to people who think they're owed more. The HOA convened a meeting in the clubhouse, and the room pulsed with indignation polished to look like unity. Douglas stood at the podium and talked about property values and precedent, and the type of community we've worked so hard to maintain, phrases that sound like oxygen if you're inside and like a locked door if you're not. Someone asked whether I could prove I was really related to the original owner. Someone else asked why I suddenly took an interest in the land they'd improved. Another wondered aloud if the sheriff could do something for safety, which is a word that can be twisted until it points at whatever makes you uncomfortable. Karen raised her hand and asked why I was making this so combative when I could be reasonable and work with leadership. Leadership, the audacity of people who built on a lie and then offered to manage your emotions about it. When my 90 days expired, their polite refusal hardened into trespass. Every front step still stood on my land without right or title. Renee filed eviction actions, one per lot, and I saw how quickly a neighborhood can turn into a courtroom once the ground beneath it remembers its name. Next door lit up in a chorus of wounded pride and righteous anger. The whispers turned into pointed comments about outsiders and lessees of culture and people who don't understand how we do things here. And if you've ever walked into a room where you're not supposed to set the temperature, you know exactly how that music plays. The sheriff increased patrols to keep things calm. A few residents tried to block the roads with lawn chairs and strollers, as if property lines could be defended with patio furniture. A week later, an investment group approached. They'd tracked the case, run the numbers, and saw a different future for Silver Pines. They offered to purchase the entire parcel. Fixtures included. Fixtures in our state include structures attached to land if no valid agreement says otherwise. And there was no valid agreement because the root was poison. Renee read every statute like a prayer and then nodded. I signed. The buyers served formal notice to every home. 30 days to vacate before demolition and restoration. Phones lit with outrage, as if I had pushed them into the lie, as if the developer hadn't sold them a dream on top of my deed, as if the clerk's office hadn't stamped their belief into something that felt like a guarantee. At the gate, Karen chained herself to the iron and shouted about heritage and community, and a few residents shouted that I was destroying everything we built, and none of them heard the echo of their own words as they bounced off history. The sheriff stood, patient and tired, repeating the judge's order like scripture. In 60 days, the subdivision emptied, some left with tears and boxes, some with curses and lawyers. Some paused at the edge of their driveways and stared at the sky the way people do when they realize the ground didn't belong to them after all. The investors took down the clubhouse first. They peeled up the golf fairways and rolled them like rugs. The machines bit the concrete and the sound was a throat clearing. After a long silence, they released a plan. Wetlands restored, hardwood groves replanted, foot trails cut with a light hand, a low-impact lodge tucked beneath the canopy, cabins spaced far enough that the trees could keep their secrets. The HOA dissolved into minutes and memories. The board stopped sending emails about mailbox colors and approved pet heights. The Facebook group, once busy with policing and praise, turned into a comment graveyard. The day the last truck pulled out, I stood on the ridge where my grandfather had taught me how to read weather by the way the lake darkened. The noise was gone. The land exhaled. I rebuilt our farmhouse with reclaimed boards and the same front porch swing that creaked under my grandfather's. Stories. I set up a conservation trust and wrote the first check into a scholarship fund in his name for agricultural students who come from families like mine, people who've been told for generations that land is a tool you work, not a legacy you keep. A month later, I ran into Douglas at a diner off Route 6, a place that smells like coffee and bacon and a little redemption. He looked smaller without the podium, stirring sugar into his cup like the ritual could sweeten what he'd done. "You destroyed us," he said, quiet like confession. I set my fork down and let the silence teach for a breath. "No, Douglas, you destroyed yourselves when you believed paperwork, without checking the soil, and when you decided my claim must be a scheme, because it came from a woman like me." He flinched at nothing in particular and looked down at his hands. A reporter called not long after and asked to profile the woman who sold the HOA's homes. I told her the truth. I take no joy in families losing houses, but I gave choices, offered paths, and was answered with slogans about values and standards that never seemed to value me. She asked what came next. "Rebuilding," I said, "the right way." 2 years turned the map back into a memory that matched my grandfather's voice. The lakes cleared. The turtles returned to the fallen logs. Deer printed their soft maps along the trails at dusk. Families came to picnic and fish in the public preserve. Kids learned to skip stones. Elders sat on benches with brass nameplates and told stories about the time a neighborhood learned that a deed speaks louder than a slogan. At the entrance, we placed a plaque. Silver Pines Nature Preserve, in memory of Aaliyah Jameson, who taught us that land can be borrowed, but never stolen. Sometimes, cars idle by the gate and I recognize faces from meetings, from whisper campaigns and long email threads. Their eyes flick between the green and the sign and something in them loosens. Or maybe that's just me needing to believe people can learn. Karen drove by once, slowed, and stared as if the trees had insulted her personally. She didn't get out. She didn't have anything to measure anymore. That's the thing about people who love rules more than neighbors. Take away their clipboard, and they forget how to say hello. I know what you want to ask. Do I regret selling the land under their homes? No, I regret that they built on fraud and mistook the comfort of paperwork. For the ethics of truth, I regret that so many people listen to the loudest voices in a clubhouse instead of the quiet facts in a courthouse. But regret doesn't change boundaries, and boundaries are how we keep peace with each other. My grandfather's voice is still here when the evening light spills gold across the field. Don't you sell it unless you can't eat otherwise, he'd say. Well, the soil eats too. It needs room to breathe, to hold rain, to shelter fox kits and let oaks throw shade without asking permission. The preserve does that now. And the resort funds the stewardship and the scholarship that will pay for the hands that keep it whole. I won't pretend. The fight didn't leave marks. You don't drag a lie into daylight without losing some skin. And yes, there were days I stood at my window, reading messages that pretended to be about covenants and compliance when they were about control, and I felt every mile of history settle on my chest. But I learned something I want carved into the inside of my mouth so I never forget. When people start using words like standards and character and property values, ask who wrote the definition and who it benefits, and when a gate tells you residents only, ask how the land beneath it came to wear that lock. Maybe you'll find a clean story, maybe you'll find a forgery wrapped in a smile. Either way, bring a good attorney and a long memory, because justice doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it shows up with a file folder and a judge who reads slowly. Sometimes it's a woman with a deed and a promise she made to a man who taught her the shape of her name. If you need a moral, here's mine. Never underestimate the person whose name is still on the deed. Some folks chase revenge with fire, but fire scorches the field. You hope to keep. I learned to use paper and patience and a courtroom where words matter more than volume. I learned that you can uproot a neighborhood and still plant a forest, and I learned that the best apology is restoration. The land back to itself. The scholarship back to the future. The story back to the truth. So when you hear that voice say, "We're protecting our community," make sure they mean everyone the land remembers, not just the ones who built last decade. And if they don't, be ready to stand on the ridge at dusk with the wind carrying your grandfather's warning and the lakes holding the sky, and say quietly and completely, "This was ours all along," and then watch how the trees, patient as law, nod. If you like this story, hit that like button, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more HOA tales and real-life neighborhood drama each week.